The handcuffs clicked around my wrists as Sheriff Karen smiled that cold, satisfied smile. My neighbors watched from their porches as she shoved me toward the patrol car, my crime apparently being the audacity to question her authority. But as I sat in that back seat, staring at my boat dock through the wire mesh window, I knew something she did not. Something that would wipe that smug expression off her face forever. You see, Karen thought she owned this lake. She had no idea that I actually did. My grandfather used to tell me that still water runs deep, and nowhere was that more true than at Miller Lake. For 37 years, this had been my sanctuary. Every morning before dawn, I would walk down the weathered wooden steps to my private dock, coffee steaming in the cool air, and prepare my small fishing boat for another peaceful day on the water. The lake stretched out like glass in those early hours, reflecting the pine trees that ringed the shoreline. My dock extended 20 feet into the water, built by my father decades ago with treated lumber that had weathered to a soft silver gray. The boat bobbed gently at the end, a modest 16-foot aluminum fishing vessel that had served 3 generations of my family. I inherited this property from my grandmother 5 years ago, along with a dusty box of old documents that I had never bothered to examine closely. The land had been in our family since the 1920s, passed down through generations of quiet, hardworking people who valued privacy and respected their neighbors. The other families around the lake understood boundaries. We waved to each other across the water, helped with emergencies, but mostly kept to ourselves. Those were simple times. I would spend hours casting my line into the deeper waters near the center of the lake, watching eagles circle overhead and listening to the gentle lap of waves against the aluminum hull. The fish were plentiful, the water was clean, and life moved at the pace it was meant to move. But even in paradise, storm clouds gather on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was securing my boat after a successful morning of bass fishing when I noticed the patrol car parked at the public access point across the lake. Sheriff Karen Morrison sat behind the wheel, binoculars raised, watching me with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Karen had been sheriff for 3 years, elected on promises to crack down on crime and restore order to our quiet county. She was a tall woman with short blonde hair and sharp features that seemed permanently set in an expression of suspicion. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her badge polished to a mirror shine, and her authority worn like armor against any challenge. I raised my hand in a friendly wave across the water, but she did not respond. Instead, she started her engine and drove slowly along the shore road, her eyes never leaving my dock. Something about her lingering stare sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. That night, I mentioned the incident to my neighbor Bob, who lived in the cabin closest to mine. He frowned and scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Karen's been asking questions about you," he said quietly. "Wanted to know how long you've been keeping your boat there, whether you had permits, that sort of thing." "Permits?" I laughed. "Bob, this is my property. My family has owned this land for generations." But his worried expression stayed with me as I walked back to my cabin. For the first time in years, I locked my doors that night. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a peaceful Friday morning that started like any other. I was sitting on the end of my dock, coffee cup balanced on the wooden planks beside me, fishing line disappearing into the dark water below. The sun was just beginning to burn off the morning mist when I heard heavy footsteps on the wooden boards behind me. "Excuse me, sir." I turned to see Sheriff Karen Morrison walking down my dock uninvited, her hand resting casually on her duty belt. She moved with the deliberate swagger of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said, reeling in my line. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by moving that boat." She pointed at my vessel with the same tone she might use to identify a dead skunk. "This is a violation of public water access laws." I set down my fishing rod and stood slowly, trying to process what I was hearing. "I'm sorry, what violation?" "Your boat is blocking public access to navigable waters," she said, pulling out a small notebook. "I've received multiple complaints from citizens who cannot launch their boats because of your obstruction." I looked around the empty lake, then back at her. "Sheriff, this is my private dock on my private property. I'm not blocking anything." Her eyes narrowed. "Water belongs to the public, mister. You cannot claim ownership of a navigable waterway." "I'm not claiming ownership of the water," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm using my own dock on my own shoreline." "Not according to the complaints I've received." She flipped through her notebook with theatrical precision. "Anonymous citizens report that your boat prevents them from accessing this section of the lake." "Can I see those complaints?" Her hand moved to her handcuffs. "Are you questioning my authority?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. I had lived in this county my entire life, paid my taxes, voted in every election, and never so much as received a speeding ticket. Now I was being treated like a criminal for using my own property. "No, Sheriff, I'm just trying to understand the problem." "The problem," she said, stepping closer, "is that you think you can do whatever you want out here. Well, I'm here to tell you that nobody is above the law, not even you." She handed me a yellow citation form. "You have 72 hours to remove that boat permanently, or I'll have it impounded as evidence of ongoing violations." I stared at the ticket, my hands trembling with anger and disbelief. "Sheriff, my family has kept boats at this dock for decades. I have every right to—" "You have 72 hours," she interrupted. "And if I were you, I would not test my patience further." She turned and walked back down my dock, her boots echoing like gunshots on the wooden planks. I watched her patrol car disappear around the bend, the citation crumpled in my fist. That afternoon, I called the county clerk's office to request copies of all complaints filed against my property. The clerk searched her computer for 10 minutes before informing me that no complaints existed in their system. Karen Morrison had just declared war on an innocent citizen, using the full weight of her office to wage a personal vendetta. She had no idea what she was up against. Sunday morning brought no peace. I was barely awake when car doors slammed in my driveway like gunshots. Through my bedroom window, I saw 2 patrol cars and Sheriff Karen standing at my front door with 3 deputies. The knock was sharp and demanding. When I opened the door, Karen thrust an official-looking document in my face. "Search warrant," she announced. "We're investigating multiple violations of marine safety codes, environmental regulations, and obstruction of public waterways." I stared at the paper, trying to make sense of the legal language. "What violations? I moved my boat yesterday like you ordered." "Too little, too late," she said, pushing past me into my living room. "We have evidence of ongoing criminal activity related to your illegal dock operation." 3 deputies spread throughout my property like locusts, photographing everything, measuring distances, and treating my family home like a crime scene. One deputy took pictures of my boat from every angle. Another measured the dock with a tape measure, writing notes on a clipboard. "Where are the complaints you mentioned?" I asked Karen. She looked at me with cold amusement. "Anonymous tips are confidential. That's how law enforcement works." "But the county clerk said no complaints were filed." Are you calling me a liar? Her hand moved to her handcuffs again. I watched helplessly as they ransacked my property for 2 hours, looking for violations that did not exist. When they finally left, my home felt contaminated by their presence. That afternoon, I drove to the courthouse and requested every document related to my family's property. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Patterson, had worked there for 40 years and remembered my grandmother. "Your family has quite a history here," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "Your property goes back to the original land grants." I spread the documents across a table in the courthouse basement, studying surveys and deeds I had never seen before. Most were routine property transfers, but buried in the pile was something extraordinary. A deed dated 1923 that made my heart race. The document was written in formal legal language, but one phrase jumped out like a neon sign, including all water rights and lake bed ownership of Miller Lake in its entirety. My great-grandfather had not just bought shoreline property, he had purchased the entire lake. I read the deed 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. According to this document, every drop of water in Miller Lake, every fish swimming beneath the surface, and every inch of lake bed belonged to my family. The so-called public access points were actually on my private property. I sat in that dusty courthouse basement until closing time, photocopying every relevant document and cross-referencing property descriptions. The evidence was overwhelming and legally bulletproof. Sheriff Karen Morrison had been harassing the legal owner of the very lake she claimed to protect for public use. She had violated my constitutional rights, conducted illegal searches, and issued fraudulent citations. But more importantly, she had made a critical error. She had picked a fight with someone who now had the legal ammunition to destroy her career. As I drove home with a box full of documents, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Karen thought she held all the cards. She was about to learn that the game had changed completely. The retaliation began the next morning and continued with the relentless precision of a military campaign. Every day brought new patrol cars, fresh citations, and increasingly creative interpretations of laws that Karen seemed to invent on the spot. Monday, a deputy arrived at 6 in the morning claiming my dock needed a commercial marina permit because it extended more than 15 feet into the water. The citation carried a $500 fine. Tuesday, Karen herself appeared with an environmental inspector, claiming my boat was leaking oil and contaminating the lake. They took water samples from around my dock while I watched helplessly from my kitchen window. Wednesday, 2 deputies photographed my property from the road, claiming they were investigating reports of unpermitted structures. When I asked to see the reports, they told me I would need to file a Freedom of Information request. Thursday, a citation appeared on my door for operating an unlicensed boat rental business. The evidence was apparently my neighbor Bob borrowing my boat the previous weekend to retrieve a fishing lure caught in the reeds. The psychological warfare was methodical and devastating. Every morning I woke wondering what new violation would be invented, what fresh humiliation awaited. The stress began affecting my sleep, my appetite, and my ability to concentrate on anything except the constant threat of legal assault. But the worst part was the isolation. Karen had been busy poisoning my relationships with the very neighbors who had been my friends for decades. Bob knocked on my door Friday evening, his weathered face creased with worry. "I'm sorry, friend," he said quietly. "Karen came by asking questions about you, wanted to know if I'd seen any suspicious activity, unusual visitors, that sort of thing." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're the most law-abiding person I know." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "But she made it clear that helping you might bring attention to my property too. She mentioned that my septic system might need inspection." The message was clear. Associate with me and face harassment yourself. It was a classic intimidation tactic, isolating the target by making support costly for anyone brave enough to offer it. Sarah Mitchell, who lived across the lake, had apparently received similar visits. Her husband called to apologize but explained that they could not afford to have their business licenses questioned. The elderly couple who lived near the boat launch stopped waving when they saw me on the water. Karen had turned my neighbors into unwilling accomplices in my isolation, using their fear of bureaucratic retaliation to build a wall of silence around me. The citations kept coming like clockwork: improper boat registration, dock safety violations, noise complaints for starting my boat motor before 8 in the morning. Each one carried fines, court dates, and the implicit threat of escalation if I continued to resist. I consulted with attorney James Harrison, a respected lawyer who specialized in property rights and constitutional law. He listened to my story with growing amazement and anger. "This is systematic harassment," he said, reviewing the stack of citations. "Sheriff Morrison is using her office to wage a personal vendetta against a citizen who has committed no crimes. Can we stop her?" "We can do better than that," he said with a grim smile. "We can expose her abuse of power and hold her accountable. But first, I need to see those property documents you mentioned." That evening, I drove to his office with my box of courthouse records. He spread the documents across his conference table, studying each deed and survey with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case. When he reached the 1923 lake ownership deed, he stopped reading and looked up at me with wide eyes. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. "I think so. You don't just own the shoreline. You own the entire lake. Every boat launch, every fishing spot, every drop of water. Sheriff Morrison has been harassing you for using your own property." The irony was so profound, it was almost funny. Karen had been acting like the protector of public water access, when in reality she had been violating the property rights of the lake's actual owner. "What do we do now?" I asked. Attorney Harrison smiled like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Now we set a trap." The next 2 weeks transformed me from a harassment victim into a legal detective, uncovering a century of property history that even I had not fully understood. Attorney Harrison connected me with a professional surveyor and a title research specialist, and together we began constructing an unshakable case. The surveyor, Maria Santos, spent 3 days mapping the lake with GPS equipment and comparing modern measurements to the original 1923 survey. Her findings were extraordinary and legally decisive. "Your great-grandfather bought this property during the Great Depression," she explained, pointing to overlaid maps spread across my kitchen table. "The original landowner was desperate to sell and included water rights that were incredibly valuable, even then. The 1923 deed was written in the formal legal language of its era, but the meaning was crystal clear once properly interpreted. My great-grandfather had purchased not just the shoreline property, but all water rights, mineral rights, and lake bed ownership of Miller Lake in its entirety, including all tributaries, inlets, and seasonal variations in water level." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you own every drop of water in this lake," Maria said. "The public access points, the boat launches, the fishing spots that people think are public property, all of it belongs to you." The title researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Grant, had spent decades studying property law and had never seen anything quite like my situation. She traced the ownership history through county records, state archives, and even federal land grant documents from the 1800s. "Your great-grandfather was apparently a very shrewd businessman," she said. "The seller included water rights to make the deal more attractive, probably never imagining how valuable lake property would become." But the most stunning discovery came when we examined the current county tax records. For nearly a century, my family had been paying property taxes on the entire lake, not just the shoreline. The county had been collecting taxes on water ownership without anyone realizing the implications. "This is legal gold," Attorney Harrison said when we presented our findings. "You have been paying taxes on lake ownership for generations. The county has accepted those payments and issued tax receipts. That creates an official record of ownership that no court can dispute." We also discovered that several of the so-called public access points had been created without proper legal authority. The county had simply designated areas as public access without verifying ownership or obtaining easements from the actual property owner. "This is a massive liability for the county," Harrison explained. "They have been allowing public use of private property without permission from the owner. Technically, every boat launch and fishing access point has been operating illegally." The research also revealed the extent of Sheriff Karen's misconduct. Not only had she been harassing the legal owner of the property she claimed to protect, but she had conducted searches and issued citations without proper legal authority. "She has violated your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure," Harrison said. "She has issued fraudulent citations for activities that were completely legal on your own property, and she has used her official position to intimidate and harass a citizen who was exercising his constitutional rights." But the most damaging evidence against Karen came from an unexpected source. While researching complaint records, we discovered that she had filed false reports claiming anonymous citizen complaints that never existed. The county clerk's computer system showed no record of the complaints Karen claimed to have received. "She fabricated evidence to justify her harassment campaign," Harrison said with satisfaction. "That's not just misconduct, that's criminal fraud." Armed with overwhelming legal evidence, we began planning our counterattack. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Invite Karen to a public meeting where she could attempt to justify her actions in front of witnesses, then systematically dismantle her authority with irrefutable legal facts. "We want maximum exposure," Harrison advised. "Karen has been using her badge to intimidate people who cannot fight back. It's time to level the playing field." I spent that weekend reviewing every document, every survey, every piece of evidence we had gathered. The transformation was remarkable. I had gone from feeling powerless and victimized to holding cards that could end Karen's career and expose the systematic abuse of power that had terrorized my community. The irony was perfect. Karen had been so focused on asserting her authority over public water access that she never bothered to verify who actually owned the water. Her arrogance and laziness had led her into a legal trap from which there was no escape. As I sat on my dock that Sunday evening, watching the sun set over my lake, I felt a calm satisfaction I had not experienced in months. Tomorrow, we would invite Sheriff Karen Morrison to explain her actions to the community she had sworn to serve. She had no idea that she was about to face the fight of her professional life. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that comes before decisive action. Attorney Harrison and I met at 7 in the morning to finalize our strategy, review our evidence one last time, and prepare for what we hoped would be the end of Karen's reign of harassment. The key is to let her dig her own grave, Harrison advised as we organized documents in his conference room. Karen's personality is her weakness. She cannot resist asserting her authority, especially when she thinks she has the upper hand. We had spent the weekend coordinating with county officials, local media, and community leaders. The meeting would take place at the lake's main public access point at 2 in the afternoon, with representatives from the county commission, the district attorney's office, and the local newspaper in attendance. I had personally called Corinne's office that morning, speaking to her directly for the first time since the harassment began. "Sheriff Morrison, this is about the ongoing dispute over my boat and dock," I said, keeping my voice neutral and respectful. "I would like to resolve this matter once and for all." "About time you came to your senses," she replied with barely concealed satisfaction. "Are you ready to comply with the law?" "I'm ready to discuss the legal issues involved. Can you meet me at the lake this afternoon? I think it would be helpful to have this conversation in public, with witnesses present." I could hear the confidence in her voice. "Fine, 2 o'clock at the main boat launch, and bring your checkbook for all those fines you owe." The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Maria Santos arrived with enlarged survey maps and GPS equipment. Dr. Grant brought copies of all the historical documents, organized in chronological order to tell the story of lake ownership. Harrison reviewed his legal brief one final time, highlighting the key points that would dismantle Corinne's authority. But for me, the most important preparation was emotional. For months, I had felt like a victim, constantly defensive and reactive to Corinne's attacks. Today, I would transform from defendant to prosecutor, from target to advocate for justice. At 1:30, I walked down to the boat launch where a small crowd had gathered. County Commissioner Janet Walsh was there with her assistant. District Attorney Robert Chen had sent his deputy prosecutor. Reporter Lisa Kim from the county newspaper stood nearby with her camera and notepad. My neighbors had come too, drawn by curiosity and perhaps hoping to witness the resolution of a conflict that had disrupted our peaceful community. Bob stood near his truck, giving me an encouraging nod. Sarah and her husband watched from across the parking area. Even the elderly couple from near the lake had come to see what would happen. At exactly 2 o'clock, Sheriff Corinne Morrison arrived in her patrol car with 2 deputies. She stepped out with the confident swagger I had learned to dread, her uniform pressed and her badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Well," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I hope you're ready to follow the law for once." She walked directly to me with her citation book already open, clearly expecting this to be another routine humiliation. The crowd watched silently as she approached, unaware that they were about to witness the exposure of systematic corruption and abuse of power. "Sheriff Morrison," I said calmly, "thank you for coming. I think it's important that our community understands the legal issues involved in this dispute." "The only thing the community needs to understand," she replied, "is that nobody is above the law, not even you." Attorney Harrison stepped forward with a briefcase full of documents and a smile that should have warned her that something was very wrong. "Sheriff Morrison," he said, "I'm James Harrison, representing the property owner. We're ready to discuss the legal issues you've raised." Corinne glanced at him dismissively. "This is simple, counselor. Your client has been violating public water access laws, and I'm here to enforce those laws." "Excellent," Harrison replied. "Let's talk about the law." The trap was set. Corinne had walked into it willingly, confidently, and publicly. In the next few minutes, her world was about to collapse. The moment of truth arrived with the weight of inevitability. Sheriff Karen Morrison stood in front of 20 witnesses, her citation book open, ready to deliver what she expected would be the final humiliation of a citizen who had dared to question her authority. "Let me make this simple," Karen announced to the crowd. "This man has been violating public water access laws for months. He thinks he can block citizens from using their lake, but I'm here to enforce the law." Attorney Harrison stepped forward with his briefcase and cleared his throat. "Sheriff, before you issue any more citations, I think you should understand exactly whose property you're standing on." Karen laughed dismissively. "Counselor, this is a public boat launch on public water. Your client doesn't own the lake." "Actually," Harrison said, opening his briefcase, "he does." The words hung in the air like smoke. Karen's confident expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "That's ridiculous. Nobody owns a lake." Harrison pulled out the 1923 deed and held it up for everyone to see. "This document, filed with the county clerk's office for over a century, grants my client ownership of Miller Lake in its entirety. Every drop of water, every inch of lake bed, and every foot of shoreline." He handed copies to Commissioner Walsh and Deputy Prosecutor Martinez. "As you can see, the deed specifically grants all water rights and lake bed ownership of Miller Lake in its entirety to my client's great-grandfather and his heirs." Karen snatched a copy and scanned it quickly, her face growing pale. This can't be legal." "It's been legal for 100 years," Harrison continued calmly. "The county has been collecting property taxes on lake ownership from my client's family for generations. Here are the tax receipts." He distributed copies of decades of tax records showing payments for lake ownership. Commissioner Walsh studied the documents with growing amazement. "My client has been paying taxes on this entire lake since the 1920s, Harrison explained. "The county has accepted those payments and issued receipts. That creates an official record of ownership that no court can dispute." The crowd murmured as the implications became clear. Every boat launch, every fishing spot, every access point they thought was public property actually belonged to me. Karen was reading the deed frantically, desperately searching for some loophole or technicality. "Even if this is real, he can't prevent public access to navigable waters." "Sheriff," Harrison said with devastating calm, "you're absolutely right about navigable waters, but this isn't navigable water. This is a private lake on private property. My client has the legal right to restrict access, charge fees, or ban anyone he chooses." He pulled out the surveyor's report with GPS measurements and maps. "Professional survey confirms that the entire lake, including this boat launch where you're standing, is private property owned by my client." Deputy Prosecutor Martinez looked up from the documents with a troubled expression. "Sheriff Morrison, did you verify property ownership before issuing citations?" Karen's authority was crumbling in real time. There were complaints, anonymous complaints about blocked access." "What complaints?" Harrison asked. "We've checked with the county clerk's office. No complaints were filed against my client's property." Commissioner Walsh frowned. "Sheriff, are you saying you issued citations based on complaints that don't exist in our records?" The trap was closing around Karen like quicksand. She looked desperately at her deputies, but they were staring at the documents with the same shock as everyone else. "This is all very interesting," Karen said, trying to regain control, "but I stand by my actions. I was protecting public access." "You were harassing the legal owner of private property," Harrison corrected. You conducted illegal searches without proper warrants. You issued fraudulent citations for legal activities on private land, and you fabricated evidence to justify your actions. He turned to Deputy Prosecutor Martinez. My client intends to file complaints for harassment, violation of civil rights, fraud, and abuse of official power. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the reality of the situation sank in. Sheriff Karen Morrison, who had terrorized citizens with her badge and authority, had been systematically violating the rights of an innocent property owner. Karen's face was red with embarrassment and anger. "This isn't over," she muttered. "Actually," I said, speaking publicly for the first time, "it is." The look of defeat in her eyes was worth every moment of harassment I had endured. Justice had finally arrived at Miller Lake. The aftermath moved with the swift inevitability of justice finally unleashed. Within 24 hours of our public confrontation, Sheriff Karen Morrison was suspended pending a full investigation by the State Attorney General's office. The evidence of systematic harassment, fraudulent citations, and fabricated complaints was overwhelming and legally devastating. County Commissioner Walsh called an emergency meeting for Thursday evening to address what she termed the most serious abuse of official power in our county's recent history. The meeting packed the courthouse with citizens who had their own stories of harassment and intimidation by Karen's department. One by one, they stood to testify. Bob described threats about his septic system inspection. Sarah spoke about pressure to stop associating with me. An elderly man from across the county told of fraudulent citations issued after he complained about excessive patrol presence in his neighborhood. The pattern was clear and damning. Karen had been using her badge as a weapon against anyone who questioned her authority or interfered with her agenda. District Attorney Chen announced that his office would pursue criminal charges against Karen for official misconduct, fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. "No one is above the law," he said, unconsciously echoing Karen's own words, especially those sworn to uphold it. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a certified letter from the county's insurance company. They were settling my civil rights lawsuit for a substantial sum, admitting that their employee had violated my constitutional protections while acting in her official capacity. The check was nice, but the apology meant more. It was official acknowledgement that I had been wronged, that my rights had been violated, and that justice demanded accountability. My relationship with the lake community transformed almost overnight. Neighbors who had been afraid to associate with me during Karen's harassment campaign stopped by to apologize and offer support. Bob brought over a case of beer and spent the evening on my dock, sharing stories and rebuilding the friendship that Karen had tried to destroy. "I should have stood up for you sooner," he said as we watched the sunset paint the water gold. "Fear made cowards of us all." "You were protecting your family," I replied. "I understand." The legal resolution opened interesting possibilities. As the owner of the entire lake, I had the right to restrict access, charge fees, or establish rules for use. But instead, I chose a different path. Working with Attorney Harrison and the County Commission, we established a public access agreement that formalized the boat launches and fishing areas that people had used for decades. The county would maintain the facilities and patrol for safety, while I retained ownership and final authority over lake use. It was a compromise that served everyone's interests. The community kept their access to the water they loved. The county avoided liability for operating on private property without permission, and I maintained my rights while being a good neighbor. Karen's replacement, Sheriff David Thompson, was a 20-year veteran who understood that law enforcement meant serving the community, not terrorizing it. He stopped by my dock a month after taking office to introduce himself and assure me that the harassment was permanently over. "I want you to know that my department respects property rights and constitutional protections," he said. "If you ever have concerns about our conduct, please call me directly." It was a conversation that should have happened years ago, the kind of respectful dialogue between citizens and law enforcement that builds trust instead of fear. 6 months later, I was back to my old routine of dawn fishing and peaceful evenings on the water. The stress of constant harassment had faded, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that justice had prevailed against corruption and abuse of power. My lake was still my sanctuary, but now it carried deeper meaning. It represented the importance of standing up to bullies, even when they wear badges. It proved that ordinary citizens can hold powerful officials accountable when they have the courage to fight back and the wisdom to use legal means. As I cast my line into the still water one morning, I thought about my grandfather's words about still water running deep. He was right about more than just fishing. Sometimes the quiet, law-abiding citizens who seem powerless are the ones with the deepest resources for justice. Karen Morrison learned that lesson the hard way, and our community is stronger because of it.